Welcome everyone to the OWASP Switzerland meeting. My name is Sven and I'm here with Patrick and Robert from over Switzerland, and already starting up is Steve, who will give today's presentation. But before, I will give some short information on OWASP and how to best enjoy today's meeting. So let me show a few slides that we've prepared. So let's see how that goes. There we go. So you joined for an OWASP Switzerland meeting, and for those that are first-timers, OWASP is a worldwide open source project. The full name is the Open Web Application Security Project, and we are focused on making application security visible and therefore making it accessible to everyone and increase the security of applications. Inside of OWASP, we have by now around 100 sub-projects, all directed to improve application security. And of course, this also means that we have a lot of volunteers working on that. If you want to support us, you can always become a member. So this is definitely a great thing to do. You also benefit as a member, for example, from things like free application security trainings, like secure coding platform you can access for free. You get reduced pricing for the entry on our global conferences that we have. So if you want to support OWASP, feel free to become a member. Now, for today, we have two ways on how you can enjoy the presentation. And one is directly that we stream on YouTube, that most likely most of you have joined. And what we learned is that there are some people, of course, and that's totally fine, that do not like to be forced to create an account and publicly ask any kind of questions. So what we did, we set up a simple application on owasp-switzerland.ch where you can ask questions at any time. And we will try to answer them either directly, or Steve will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. But this should provide you with a way of asking questions, providing feedback without needing any account on YouTube. There, just as a quick warning, there are some security measures in place, but we are not, we've not built in something like denial of service protection, things like that. So please make sure that you do not try to break that, so everyone can enjoy it as best. Both on YouTube itself and on owasp-switzerland.ch, you can watch the video directly streamed from YouTube, either in the window, or you can, of course, also open it in full screen, or you can also access it from any kind of mobile device you like. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Steve Springett, who will be today's presenter, and Steve will present us the presentation Reducing Supply Chain Risk with SBOM and DependencyTrack. Steve is very active in the open source scene and is the lead of the OWASP Dependency-Track project. So I think we couldn't have anyone better explaining us what it's doing, why we need it. And so by that, I'm handing over to you, Steve. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Sven, Robert, Patty. Thanks for having me. Welcome, OWASP Switzerland. I can't wait for the next time I can get back to Switzerland with COVID and everything. It's been taxing on everyone, but glad to be virtually here. So thanks for joining. Today I'm going to be talking about reducing supply chain risks with SBOMs and DependencyTrack. So let me go ahead and share my presentation. Let's see. Okay. So real quick, a little bit about me. I'm the creator of the DependencyTrack project. It's a flagship OWASP project created in 2013. It's been adopted by lots of organizations. So original creator of that. I'm also the original creator and current chair of the CycloneDX software bill of materials standard. This standard actually came out of a lot of the work that we were doing at OWASP with software bill of materials. It's has since evolved. It's a very widely used SBOM specification and is now currently an OWASP project, flagship project. I'm the current lead and co-author of the OWASP Software Component Verification Standard, or SCVS. I'm one of the admins on the package URL specification. I do a lot of participation in various working groups and whatnot. And what I actually get paid to do is software security architecture at ServiceNow, where I help thousands of developers create secure and resilient software. So a little bit about the project. Again, it's a flagship OWASP project created in 2013. We've been doing SBOMs for quite a long time. It's a highly mature project used by tens of thousands of organizations. We have a large community of adopters and contributors, over 1 million Docker pulls across all the various repos that we have. And it is obviously open source. It's Apache 2.0 licensed. And what is an SBOM? Well, an SBOM is, to have an analogy, is a list of ingredients. Now, this is a very, very simple analogy, but we're trying to get to the point where if I have a application, maybe it's an IoT device, maybe it's an IoT toaster, I don't know, or some enterprise application. What are the list of ingredients in that thing that I may or may not purchase, right? And the threat model here is, maybe I'm allergic to peanuts, right? And I'm doing a real-time threat model. And yeah, this is maybe something that I want to avoid. Well, in the security space, there's probably some open source projects that we also want to actively avoid. And Struts might be one of those. This is a better analogy, however. Having a list of ingredients is fairly elementary. And unfortunately, that's the analogy used by most people when they're communicating SBOMs. That's not really a good analogy, though. This is actually a much better analogy. So this is the interior of an automobile. And inside the automobile, you have a dashboard component. And inside the dashboard component, you have a combination meter component, right? With your tachometer and your speedometer and these types of things. And each one of those might have subcomponents, right? LEDs, resistors, capacitors, etc. So this is a much better analogy because each of these parts could come from different suppliers, right? And have completely different software supply chains all wrapped up into one. So you could actually describe this type of hierarchical representation of your inventory with multiple suppliers in an SBOM. So this is a much better analogy, in my opinion. It's just a harder analogy to communicate to folks. There's two SBOM formats really in existence today. CycloneDX, which is security focused, it's come out of the OWASP world. And then SPDX, which comes out of Linux Foundation, very heavily on license and intellectual property use cases. They're trying to get into security. We'll see what happens. CycloneDX is a flagship OWASP project. It handles dozens and dozens of software security use cases. It is currently the leading SBOM format. We have the widest array of tools that are available. It's supported by lots of software security vendors, SCA vendors, and other kinds of vendors as well. And again, it is a flagship OWASP project. These are the URLs to check it out. A couple things about the project that you should probably know is that we've got a a tool center that actually has a list of all the various types of tools. So if you are interested in the build time creation of SBOMs, or maybe you're interested in GitHub Actions, right? Or maybe you were interested in transforming them to some other format. It has a list of all the known available tools. If you find tools that aren't in that list, submit a pull request and we can add those. SBOMs are becoming a thing for a lot of different reasons. Number one is compliance, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of outside influence on having the inventory actually transparently provided to consumers as part of compliance. There's also regulatory things like the US FDA, which handles the Food and Drug Administration, which handles like pre-market medical devices, for example. Think pacemakers and infusion pumps and these types of things, which all have some kind of embedded operating system and libraries and an application and even some kind of external interfaces wirelessly. So regulation is another one. One of the things that I've seen, however, is a lot of focus on quality, right? So just using the fewer number of suppliers, the best quality suppliers, and actually tracking your inventory throughout your build lifecycle, and then being able to do that across everything that you're actually producing or acquiring. Think Equifax here, right? If they would have only known within seconds where in their environment they were potentially affected by threats, for example, they might have actually been able to remediate the issues much faster. Market forces, I've seen this a number of times. And this is where I think CycloneDX as a software bill of material standard actually really shines. Providing the list of inventory is actually really easy, right? Providing a list of things where you may not necessarily be vulnerable to things, that's much harder. So there's a lot of market forces in play here on what's driving some of this software bill of material adoption. One of the interesting things, though, that I find is some of these use cases that I never ever envisioned when I started down this SBOM path several years ago, and forensics being one of them. The National Transportation and Safety Board, which is a U.S. federal agency that investigates incidents. For example, if an airline crashes, right, God forbid, what was the software that was in play during that incident, right? So that you could actually reproduce, maybe it'll be helpful in various types of forensics. So there's all kinds of other use cases that SBOM is kind of contributing to this. As one of the newer things that's now contributing to this is the U.S. had an executive order a couple of weeks ago that now requires software bill of materials in all software supplied to the federal government. Being the economic force that the United States is, this is driving other countries, other industries to also adopt this. So it's there's a lot of different forces in play. So if you haven't adopted software bill of materials yet, you probably should strategically start to do so. So what does DependencyTrack actually do then, right? One of the questions that I get all the time is, well, what's the difference between DependencyCheck and DependencyTrack? These are two entirely different tools, both of which are flagship OWASP projects. I was actually one of the first contributors to the DependencyCheck project back in 2012. I worked with Jeremy Long on his project. And these two projects, even though they share a similar name, approach this problem of third-party libraries and whatnot from entirely different perspectives. Right? These are not. It's not like one tool is better than the other. That's totally not the case. These are just different ways of looking at the same problem. DependencyCheck is a SCA tool, right? It looks at files on the file system and extracts evidence from those. DependencyTrack, which is this project, is really about software bill of materials, right? So having that inventory first, and then being able to analyze that for various forms of risk that SCA tools can't actually do today. So it's a different way of looking at the same problem. I think there's a comparison of the tools being added to the description of the show notes. So what does DependencyTrack do then? Well, it consumes, analyzes, and produces SBOMs at high velocity. Cool. It is ideal for use in modern build pipelines. It is ideal for procurement and M&A. So if I'm good at build pipelines, that's great. Maybe I'm building my own software, right? I've got thousands of applications that I'm building in my environment. I can produce SBOMs for those relatively simply and ingest those into DependencyTrack. But you know what? If I'm acquiring software, right? Maybe I potentially want to purchase some software. Well, now as part of that procurement process for vendor risk management, for example, I might actually require during my procurement process an SBOM from that potential vendor. And then with that SBOM, I can ingest that in DependencyTrack and then analyze that for any types of risk. So I can make risk-based decisions before I actually buy something. Or I will know, for example, in the case of M&A, I might actually know what my potential risk is for this type of risk anyway, before I actually go out and acquire a company, for example. And DependencyTrack is really good at answering the question of what is affected and where. Think Equifax again, right? If I've got tens of thousands of applications in my environment, which one of those use struts? That would be really helpful information. So conceptually, this is what DependencyTrack actually does. I have an asset, and that asset could be a microservice. It could be an IoT toaster. I don't know. It could be some enterprise application, could be a desktop app. Doesn't really matter. I have an asset, and then I have an SBOM or just a bill of material for that asset. And then I analyze it, right? Really simple conceptually. This is going down a little bit lower. This is what it actually kind of does. So you start out doing the production of the software bill of materials, right? This is fairly simple to do. Again, CycloneDX supports the widest range of development languages and build systems to date. So there's a very good possibility that your language is covered. Everything from CocoaPods to NPM and Java and Maven to Elixir and Erlang, it's all kind of covered. So you produce SBOMs in your build pipeline using native tools, so very easy to integrate. You then ingest those SBOMs into DependencyTrack. And obviously, automation is what we want to strive for. There are, DependencyTrack has a REST-based API, so it's API first design. So you can, upload it in your CI/CD pipeline. There's a Jenkins plugin. There's all kinds of other plugins. I think there's a Circle CI orb for it. Anyway, ingest it into DependencyTrack. There's also manual use cases because procurement and M&A, for example, those use cases would require a manual step. So either automatically or manually just ingest it in DependencyTrack. And then DependencyTrack just magically analyzes it, right? It analyzes the components for any kind of security, operational, or license risk. And then once the SBOM is in there, DependencyTrack is going to continuously monitor that inventory, right? It's going to continuously monitor every single component across all of your applications in DependencyTrack on a daily basis, looking for known vulnerabilities, whether it's out of date or not, any kind of policy violations, that sort of thing. But that kind of data doesn't really benefit anybody if it's solely in DependencyTrack, right? Now I need to do something about it. right? So maybe I have some policy violations, or maybe I have some new vulnerabilities. Well, DependencyTrack actually supports a wide array of different type of notifications. Everything from webhooks to Slack and Teams integration, but the information really that are in these streams has enough context for you to make automated policy-based decisions, right? So if a new component is introduced that has a vulnerability, that might actually warrant breaking a build, for example, versus a existing component that has a new vulnerability. Maybe I put that into a warning state and automatically create a JIRA ticket from that, right? So there's enough information in these streams for you to make automated policy-driven decisions based off of. So that's really what the platform is about. And let's take a demo real quick and see this in practice. Let me share my browser window here. Okay, so let's go back to the dashboard here. So this is the first thing that you're going to see when you log into DependencyTrack. Bunch of nice little metrics, that sort of thing. We've got time series metrics for a lot of different things. What we call the portfolio, which is basically just the aggregate of all the projects in DependencyTrack, the number of projects at risk, the number of vulnerable components used across all of my projects. And then we have like this weighted risk score that we use to communicate what the risk is. Again, vulnerabilities, critical, high, medium, low over time. So nice little pretty charts here. Got some policy violations, again, time series metrics. Much like static analysis, sometimes it actually takes human intervention to determine whether or not something is or is not an issue or not. So we have auditing process over time, components projects and components over time as well. So let's look at a few projects that we have already. And if I go to my list of projects, you can see here that I can create a new project. And if I create one, I can give it a name, I can give it a version, I can say if it's, what type of project it is, give it some other information. For example, I might want to tag something with, maybe this is internet facing, or maybe I have a certain policy name, whatever. So I can tag these things, but I can also give these things identity, right? So if my project is actually going to be distributed somewhere, well, I can actually provide that information, right? Including the CPE, if I might have one, and a SWID tag ID. But let's go ahead and look at an existing project. Let's look at WebGo. Since WebGo is an existing OWASP project, we'll take a look at that. And this is WebGo 810. And again, you're going to see vulnerabilities over time, critical, high, medium, lows. You're going to see my policy violations over time, license and operational risk over time. And let's go to the list of components here. So when I imported my SBOM, this is what I get. I'm not going to demonstrate the entire workflow today, with Jenkins and everything else, but it's fairly elementary. The documentation is quite extensive. But this is the manual use case. If you just want to upload an SBOM, this is how you would do it. Anyway, this is the list of components that is in WebGo. And you can see that the component has a name, a version, a group, whether or not it's an internally developed component or not. This is really important. So for example, if I am Acme Incorporated, I might not want to externally analyze Acme Incorporated components with the outside world, right? So I can identify whether or not a component is internal or not, and I can do that automatically. It has the license, and it has whether or not there's any known vulnerabilities in there. Looks like, let's just take a look at this, for example. Bootstrap 337 has some known vulnerabilities. I can actually take a look at the vulnerabilities in Bootstrap 337, for example. DependencyTrack supports a number of different data sources for vulnerability intelligence. It supports OSS index from Sonatype. It supports the NVD directly. It supports VulnDB from risk-based security, and it supports NPM advisories. There are plans to incorporate SNCC, the commercial source of vulnerability intelligence from Sonatype for Nexus IQ, as well as GitHub advisories, and Google also has a project now for advisories. So there are plans to expand out the number of sources of vulnerability intelligence that DependencyTrack supports. Let's go back to the WebGo project, but I can go into any one of these and make audit decisions on these things. So actually, let's look at the dependency graph first, actually. So DependencyTrack can automatically create a dependency graph for you. And this is the current visualization. There's other visualizations for the dependency graphs coming in the future, but this is the current one, and there's going to be additional ones in the future. But it looks like WebGo has 1, 2, 3. Looks like it has 3 direct dependencies, and then it looks like it has these modules, these other components, which then include other components. So you can very easily identify how components were actually introduced into your dependency graph with this kind of visualization. We can also look at the audit. We can also look at the vulnerabilities and make audit decisions based on those things. So for example, if I'm just picking on Bootstrap just because I know there's issues with it. But if we go down here to Bootstrap, this particular CVE, for example, this was actually found by OSS index. So I have the attribution here. If I click on this, for example, it will actually take me to that vulnerability on OSS index. Likewise, if I have a vulnerability from VulnDB or NPM advisories, the attribution will take me to those respective sites. Obviously, it gives me the severity as well, and I can sort by severity. I can sort by analyzer and when the vulnerabilities were attributed on, so I can find like what is the newest, what is the oldest, etc. But I can go into each one of these things and make audit decisions based on these things. So it looks like this particular one, for example, is a cross-site scripting issue on the tooltip, right? So I can make an audit decision based on this. For example, maybe in my particular case, I'm only using the Bootstrap CSS and not the Bootstrap JavaScript, just for the sake of argument here. So I'm going to say not using the Bootstrap JavaScript component. And then I can add that to my comment trail and just say that this issue is not, I'm not affected by this, right? So you can make these audit decisions, and DependencyTrack will maintain this audit trail, this immutable audit trail for you. And then I can go ahead and suppress the issue. That way my metrics and whatnot will be, the next time my project is analyzed, the number of vulnerabilities in this particular case will actually go down, right? And my audit progress will actually go up. So I've made an audit decision based on that, saying I'm not affected by this because I'm not using the JavaScript component of Bootstrap, only the CSS component of Bootstrap. And then you can also look at policy violations. So let's see. Okay, looks like I got some prohibited licenses that I have in my application. So let's take a look at this one. Okay, GPL. So maybe my organization actually has a policy that prohibits me from using any kind of GPL license for whatever reason, right? So I can create these types of policies, and again make audit decisions based on that. So if, for example, the GPL would actually be okay in this particular case, I can actually make this kind of analysis as well. So I can go ahead and approve it or reject it or whatever. And again, I can suppress this particular finding or this particular policy violation. One of the things that DependencyTrack, again, is really useful for is being able to identify where in your environment things actually are. So again, going back to that Equifax example, knowing where in your environment stress actually was would be really helpful if you have not a lot of time to remediate. So in this particular case, I don't think I have any struts in my portfolio, but you know what I probably actually have? I probably have some Java data, Jackson data bind. So let's go ahead and search for that. Now I can actually search by coordinates. I can search by package URL. I can search by CPEs. I can search for SWID tag IDs. And I can also search based on hash value. So for example, I might actually have a component. I don't know, maybe it's a crypto library. And maybe there's a malicious version of that same crypto library in the wild somewhere, and they all have that same hash value. Well, I can actually search for that across my entire portfolio, which is really helpful if I want to try to identify if I'm actually using that malicious version of that cryptographic library. But let's go ahead and go back to coordinates here, because I want to search for Jackson data bind. And oh yeah, it looks like I am using Jackson data bind. Actually, I'm using vulnerable versions of Jackson data bind against two different projects, the Acme Portal project and the WebGo project. So now I can go into these projects and actually try to audit them, right? And determine whether or not I'm actually going to be impacted by my use of Jackson data bind or not. So this is really helpful in trying to determine where in your environment something actually resides. So in this case, I'm doing another search for Bootstrap, and it looks like Bootstrap is also used in WebGo, but it's also used in this Acme profile service, a couple different cases here. So anyway, again, being able to answer where am I, what is affected and where is really what DependencyTrack is focused on. But you can also search for it by the other direction. Let's actually find that Jackson data bind. I just want to show you something real quick. Let's find, here we go. Let's actually do a search for this, because you can also come to it from the other direction, right? So maybe a new vulnerability with a shiny logo and a marketing website is on all the news outlets now. And you want to see whether or not you have any components in your environment that are actually affected by that thing. So I can go to that vulnerability and I can actually see information about that vulnerability, right? So this is all of my information about that vulnerability that the DependencyTrack has, as well as any projects in my portfolio that are actually impacted by this vulnerability. So I can come to it from the completely opposite perspective as well. So lots of software security use cases there, but you know, SBOMs also can support licenses, right? And CycloneDX and DependencyTrack support SPDX license IDs and expressions. So this is a list of all the licenses. So you can actually do some research here, and maybe you want to search for the Apache 2.0 license, right? So you can go in here, find the Apache 2.0 license, And this is the official text and the template and what you would use as a source header, for example. So anyway, all the valid SPDX license IDs are listed within DependencyTrack, which then allows you to create policies based on some of those license things. So DependencyTrack has a full-blown policy engine that allows you to create policies on a number of different things. And the policy engine, the capabilities of that are going to be expanding over the next couple of releases, which I'm really excited about. Out of the box, so when you install DependencyTrack, by default, it comes with 4 different license groups. And these license groups are, have names. This is the list of all copyleft license groups, for example. So many organizations might be weary about using some of these licenses, especially like the AGPL, for example. Your non-commercial, your permissive, and your weak copyleft, right? So this is going to be like your Eclipse and Mozilla and whatnot. But you can create your own license groups as well. So for example, I might want to create a license group for, my extreme copyleft license, like the AGPL, for example. So I can create my own license groups there. And then once I actually have defined what my organization, what I want for these license groups, now I can actually create policies around these things. Let's look at this particular policy. And this particular policy just says that if a component has a license that is copyleft, then the policy violation state will then go into a warning state, right? So I'm not gonna inform, I'm not gonna fail, I'm just simply going to create a warning whenever this happens. And I can keep on creating conditions for this. So I can, excuse me. So I can build up my policy with and or ors and whatnot. So it's fairly flexible. But you can also create other types of policies, right? This is a list of prohibited components, for example. And it looks like my policy here is actually looking for anything that has struts, right? Because maybe my organization is allergic to struts, right? So I can actually fail. In this case, I'm actually failing policy if I have a project that has a component with anything, excuse me, with struts in the name. Oh, excuse me. There's a number of different policies that you can also create. So it's fairly flexible. And you can create policies currently. Let's actually create one. Excuse me, allergies. So let me just show you some of the conditions that you can currently do. So you can do it based on severity currently. You can do it based on coordinates, so group name version. License, like a very specific license, for example. So maybe I just, instead of doing a license group, maybe I just want to do, just the AGPL licenses, for example. Individually, I could do that. I could do it based on package URL. I could do it based on CPE, SWID tag ID, or I can also just do it based on the version of the component itself. There's other policy conditions that are in the works. So if you have ideas for these things in the future, please let us know. We monitor all the issues on GitHub. So anyway, that's policy management. And for administration, we support a number of different analyzers. Again, we have an internal analyzer that supports CPEs directly with the NVD. We support NPM advisories, OSS index from Sonatype, and VulnDB from risk-based security. Again, support for other types of analyzers are coming in the future. But we also do like outdated components, right? And I think I might have glossed over that. We can go back and take a look. But we support a number of different repositories. For example, I'll just pick on Maven just because I know there's multiple repositories. So out of the box, it's going to ship with all the various public repositories that are widely in use. But you can also create your own repository, right? Lots of organizations have internal artifactories or Nexus repositories, for example. So you can actually specify what those repositories are. That way you can do outdated component analysis for your internally developed components as well. Full notification support. We integrate natively with Fortify Software Security Center, Defect Dojo, as well as Kenna Security. And then, of course, there's all kinds of integrations with other commercial and open source tools as well. Things like Security Compass and CodeDX and others as well. And then, of course, we have access management. We support LDAP, internally managed users, as well as OIDC. So it's quite flexible with how you actually deploy this. So let's see. That is well, let me just show you real quick the outdated components, just so you see that, because I kind of glossed over that last time. But these little indicators here, the warnings is just telling me that this particular component is out of date. I can also, instead of having to hover over each one of these things, I can also just include the latest version of this thing. That way I can just have the side-by-side view of what my current version is versus what I'm using versus what the current version is. So that way I don't have to hover over all these things in my project. So let's get back to the presentation. Stop sharing this. Go back to the PowerPoint. So what we just saw here, isn't this just SCA? Kind of. It kind of does the same things, right? Yeah, not really. It's not SCA at all. One of the difficult things around this whole space is actually the most obvious, which is the inventory. SCA tools are designed to identify risk. They're not designed to identify an accurate inventory. And you would think these things would be interrelated, in which they are, but most SCA tools, if something is close enough, it's good enough, right? I mean, if I'm one minor version off on something, does it really matter? Sometimes, yes, right? Think of forensics cases, right? It absolutely will matter. So having an accurate inventory is really what software bill of materials are all about. And from that accurate inventory, then we actually start analyzing for various forms of risk. So it's a different way. But we can also, if we're going back to the dashboard analogy, right? If we're going back to that dashboard analogy where we had an assembly of things, right? We had a dashboard component, and in the dashboard component, we had an instrument meter component. And within the instrument meter component, we had a tachometer component and a speedometer component, maybe a check engine light component. Hopefully those never go off. But anyway, we have this kind of nested relationship, right, with suppliers from different, that have provided me components from their own supply chain, right? So I can actually represent that kind of nested supply chain relationship with an SBOM, right? That's not something that SCA tools are designed to do. The other interesting thing is really about provenance, right? Where did I get something from, right? SCA tools, most of them, don't actually tell you this, right? They'll tell you what the affected component is, but it won't actually tell you where you got it from, which is highly important, right? There's been a number of cases where maybe at the time that I built something, maybe the mirror that I retrieved something from was actually compromised versus the other mirror, which might not have, been compromised, right? So I might have actually got a malicious component because the mirror that I actually got something from was actually compromised at that particular time. So actually knowing where you got something is really, really important, right? This is not something that SCA Tools really are designed to do today. The other thing here that software bill of materials, specifically CycloneDX, will give you is pedigree. And by pedigree, I mean what changes to open source have I made? Because open source is the ultimate supply chain. I can fork things, I can make changes to things, I can rename things, I can redistribute those things. And when I do redistribute that modified version of my component, it has a new identity, and I can actually describe the descendants variants, and I can describe that lineage, right? What that origin component was, what my new component is, and what were the commits or the diffs or the patches that actually went into making my component unique, who made those changes, when they were made, and what the specific changes were. So that full pedigree information is fully supported in things like CycloneDX, for example. And this is truly important because there's going to be a number of times where you might not have the luxury of upgrading to the latest version of component because maybe there's breaking API changes, right? Or maybe the component is no longer supported anymore, right? There is no newer versions. But you still need to be able to maybe backport some security fixes, right? Or apply some security fixes to this version of that component that you're using. And you need to communicate to the outside world potentially that yes, you're using this component, but you're not actually affected by this vulnerability because you've actually made these commits, you've actually made these changes to that component, which have mitigated these particular vulnerabilities, right? So you can completely document all that sort of information with pedigree in a software bill of materials, right? Again, this is not something that SCA Tools can do today. Packaging and distribution use cases also. Again, if I'm a supplier of software, I need to communicate that inventory of what it is that I'm actually producing, in many cases to the outside world, right? To my potential customers, to my partners, right? So we can communicate that inventory and all the provenance and all that pedigree information. We can communicate that information outward, if we so choose, in a standardized software bill of material format, right? This is industry standard. And then other folks can actually import that, right? So packaging and distribution use cases are not something, that SCA was necessarily designed to do. Remediation and disclosure as well. Again, if I've actually fixed vulnerabilities in a component, I've backported those fixes, or maybe, just maybe, I want to disclose what vulnerabilities actually exist in these components, I can actually do so in a software bill of material. I can do it in a lot of different ways, actually. So I would encourage everyone to visit the CycloneDX website and actually go through the list of use cases because many of them are truly fascinating. In CycloneDX, we refer to ourselves as a bill of material standard. We refer to pretty much everything as just the BOM, right? And CycloneDX also handles hardware. Not very well, but it does handle hardware today. And there are plans on improving hardware support. So we've got a number of IoT vendors, for example, that actually want to do this. So we're actively working with that community to try to help them support their hardware use cases better. And finally, not everything is about the actual software components themselves. I don't know if I actually own any software that doesn't talk to the outside world, right? SCA Tools, for the most part, they're only looking at the libraries and frameworks, right? They're not necessarily looking at, maybe I have a shim library it was automatically generated from a Swagger DAC, for example, or automatically generated from GraphQL or whatever. the component may not necessarily have any functionality in and of itself. It relies on some kind of API. Maybe it's Google Maps, or maybe checking the weather or stock quotes. So you can actually describe in a software bill of material, you can actually describe services. And your services are actually part of your dependency graph. So you can describe, hey, I've got this component which depends on this service. So it's all kind of interrelated. We view this as just a serialization difference, really. And in fact, there is enough information in an SBOM, in a CycloneDX SBOM, to actually dynamically produce a data flow diagram that would be useful for, I don't know, a threat model or some kind of other form of analysis. For example, I could definitely see some future integration with OWASP Zap and other similar kind of tools, right? And in fact, I want to show you a quick demo of what that actually looks like in DependencyTrack. So I'm just going to switch back to the DependencyTrack demo. And let's see. And in this particular case, I actually want to go to my IoT toaster project, because what toaster should not be connected to the internet? What could possibly go wrong? So here I have 3 components, very elementary components. I have my dependency graph of these 3 components, but I also have my services, right? And services are a root level object. It actually tells you whether or not authentication is required, whether or not it crosses a trust boundary, whether it actually has any vulnerabilities or not. So if I go into in this particular case, it's a stock ticker service, but you'll see here that it's fully capable, excuse me, of supporting, vulnerabilities, policy violations, operational risk. So there's a lot more functionality coming to DependencyTrack in the near future with regard to this. But you can identify the service, right? Who the provider of that service is. You can have the URLs, any kind of support contacts if you want. You can describe the endpoint URLs, right? So in this particular case, I have 2 endpoints that I have, and I can support the data classifications and the direction of flow of each one. And then, of course, I have external references. Maybe I want to look at the Swagger docs or whatever the case is. But there's definitely a lot of potential here for integration with other types of tools. There's also some really interesting work that is happening with regard to telemetry information. So actually using a software bill of material as a kind of a baseline, I guess. So this is what my application should be doing versus what it's actually doing, right? So you can actually, there's a lot of work by some commercial vendors in this space to try to make that a reality, which is really, really interesting. But if services and this kind of thing is interesting to you, I would highly encourage you to kind of get involved. I think obviously there's some synergy with some other OWASP projects here, and as well as some commercial tool support. So there's really a lot of things that we could potentially do here, which is really fun. So yeah, this is not SCA. This is looking at the problem from a much more holistic perspective, from a different, much wider lens, and looking at a lot of different types of software security risk. So yeah, this is making progress. So real quick, what kind of integrations do we have? Again, we support CycloneDX. We support a number of different sources of vulnerability intelligence, a lot of different types of repositories, the vulnerability aggregation platforms we talked about. Nice little shiny logos on this screen. But this is our current list of I guess, all known integrations. There's probably a lot of unknown integrations as well. If you know of anyone that we're missing, please let us know. Anyway, here's the project information. It's obviously available on GitHub for everyone. We have social media accounts. We have a YouTube channel for DependencyTrack as well. Documentation is fairly robust. But if you're wanting to contribute to the project, this is an area where it would be really good to start, actually. If DependencyTrack is kind of a large project, but if you want to start contributing, for example, this is a really good place to start as you kind of build up your knowledge of DependencyTrack and how it actually works. We're always looking for contributions, no matter how big or how small. And then, of course, our publicly available website as well. So with that, I thank you, OWASP Switzerland, for taking the time to spend during this session. And at this point, I will open it up for questions and answers.
Yeah, so first of all, also from OWASP Switzerland, thanks a lot for the great presentation, Steve. I think by now everyone that joined today should definitely understand why DependencyTrack is something to at least try out, if not put in production use in their company. So I think it's a very valuable tool. And I've already seen that we have quite some questions that came in during the presentation. And of course, if people watching now still have questions, feel free to just post them in either on YouTube or on owaspswitzerland.ch so that we can ask them to Steve. So, let me quickly check what kind of questions we actually have. So one that we have is that if companies start using OWASP DependencyTrack, how do you see them dealing with the situation that they will not be able to like put all their applications in, because there might be some that are outside of the CI/CD pipeline, some that are done by third parties, so they won't ever have like the full coverage. So how do those kind of companies deal with not being able to like have the final answer on, for example, do we have that specific vulnerability X in our application and only have a certain degree of assurance?
Got it. Yeah. So, again, the DependencyTrack has a REST-based API. Everything is API first. So it would be entirely possible, not only if you outside of the CI obvious integration. There's possibilities with other types of platforms. For example, you could have any kind of workflow application, whether it's like a ServiceNow application or something similar, maybe that's in use by maybe your procurement folks. And as part of that workflow, you could then require maybe your strategic sourcing department, for example. You could provide them the ability to actually just ask for that software bill of material from that vendor. And as part of that workflow, you could actually trigger the upload to DependencyTrack. So you can certainly do this outside of a CI pipeline. I've seen it done a number of different ways. And of course, there's that manual use case that's also supported, right? So in a lot of cases, you might not necessarily have that kind of automated workflow where your sourcing folks can actually request those SBOMs from the vendors and upload them through your your management platform. You might actually just rely on email, right? That's probably the easiest form of how you might actually get an SBOM. But that's okay, right? You get that email from that vendor that includes that SBOM. You can upload it into DependencyTrack. Obviously not ideal. I think organizations should probably try to work with other folks, right? So security, we've kind of been in this bubble of working with ourselves. Obviously in AppSec, we work with developers. With SCA Tools, we also work with licenses, our legal team. But with SBOMs, we also need to add in our procurement folks, right? So we need to bring them to the same table. And when we do that, we're going to find out what their existing processes are. And again, there should be some fairly easy wins on how to integrate DependencyTrack with their existing processes.
Okay. So the next one, directly going into the same direction that you just talked on, like the non-ideal way on doing integration over email and things like that. There were two questions rather similar. One is regarding the integration with Jira. The other was with OWASP Defect Dojo. We've seen on your slide regarding the integration that there are integrations done. What kind of integration would that be? So, for example, for Jira, is that like bidirectional, or I've seen that for Defect Dojo, it seems that it only pushes information to Defect Dojo, but cannot include this information. How does in what direction is traffic normally going, and how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually not too familiar with the Defect Dojo integration. I did not write it. That was a community contribution. The documentation, if you go to docs.dependencytrack.org, will actually say, tell you actually what the integration actually covers. It's interesting, however, that even though DependencyTrack there's integration with Defect Dojo there, and I think it covers like one of a few different use cases today. Defect Dojo also supports CycloneDX directly, right? One of the things that you can do with CycloneDX is describe what vulnerabilities that you have in your software bill of material, and Defect Dojo can actually import that directly, which is really interesting. So there's a lot of different ways, I think, that you can get that information into dependency or into Defect Dojo, and if your specific way of integration with Defect Dojo isn't actually covered today, I would highly encourage you to reach out to create a ticket on GitHub for DependencyTrack. Ideally, submit a pull request, right, to expand that coverage out, so we do cover more use cases for that. As for Jira, there isn't actually any native defect tracking integration built into DependencyTrack. That's something that we want to do. However, what is currently supported are those webhooks, right? And what we find is that most organizations have very custom workflows that they want to do anyway. So having native like defect tracker integration isn't usually ideal, because again, in many cases, like in the case of that Twitter Bootstrap example, I don't want to create an issue for something if something actually isn't, if my team actually isn't impacted by that, right? So the last thing I want to do is really make the development teams upset at me, right? By creating unnecessary tickets. But what I can do is create a very simple service to actually monitor for these various types of webhooks, and then based on whatever processes I have in place whether in my organization, I can then trigger something to happen. Maybe I do want that Jira ticket to be created. Maybe I only want it created for certain projects, or maybe only under certain severity of issues, for example. There's enough information in those webhooks to make those types of decisions. And we really give you all that information in the webhook, and really encourage each organization to kind of build out their own workflow.
Okay, just one question right on that. For the webhook, if, for example, there is an identified vulnerability in a certain version, and now, for example, somebody closes this in a like Jira ticket, is there a way on connecting those in a way that, for example, if a ticket is closed, the webhook would also in DependencyTrack basically say, okay, this should now not be shown anymore as a problem in the future, even though it might still be there?
Absolutely not, and that's a behavior that we don't actually want.
Okay.
Again, developers can close tickets for a number of different reasons. Maybe they're closing it because it's something they're not going to fix, right? So the only thing that's really going to close it is a software bill of material that's been uploaded, and which actually includes the fix. For example, we looked at the Jackson data bind, right, in WebGo. I was using a vulnerable version of Jackson data bind. What would make that vulnerability go away is me actually upgrading to a non-vulnerable version of that component, and then you'll see that vulnerabilities for that older version go away. So that's really the only way for those things to go away. Or you can make the audit decision. Maybe this is something that you're not actually going to fix. You can actually make that kind of audit decision and then suppress the issue. Now, there's an opportunity there, however, for you to make that one-way connection from Jira to DependencyTrack. So if you are, for example, making those comments in the Jira ticket, for example, it would be really interesting for you to also make those same comments, I guess, in the DependencyTrack audit trail. That way, there's actually a full record of that actually happening. So that support obviously would actually probably have to be custom done, but it should be fairly elementary to do.
Okay, cool. So what else do we have? So there is, again, a question regarding DependencyCheck versus DependencyTrack. So you mentioned that basically DependencyTrack also includes, like, let's say, certain features that also come with OWASP DependencyCheck, like the whole scanning and basically mapping it to vulnerabilities. Would you say that people fully leveraging the possibilities of DependencyTrack actually still need tools like OWASP DependencyCheck or other SCA tools?
Sorry, coughing for some reason today. You know, these two tools are for entirely different purposes. You know, DependencyCheck is it looks at files on the file system and extracts evidence from those files. And based on that evidence, it's going to do some fuzzy matching against a few different sources of vulnerability intelligence. But it does fuzzy matching, which means that you're going to get false positives, right? False positives by design. Sure. So that's really the goal of that project. So I would use DependencyCheck, for example, if I don't know what something is, right? That's an ideal use case for DependencyCheck. Maybe I'm actually looking at a piece of code that my organization didn't produce, or maybe it was produced so long ago that the build artifacts are no longer with us, and I want to know what's in it. DependencyCheck is actually a really good tool for that. DependencyTrack is just the opposite, though. It doesn't scan any files. In fact, there are no files. You only have a software bill of material, and that is an assertion of fact. So it's an assertion of what inventory I have, as well as the services and the pedigree and the provenance and everything else that we also talked about. So it's a different way of looking at the same problem, but it's a much more, it looks at the supply chain perspective from a much more wider lens. DependencyTrack does, because it does leverage software bill of materials, which do have much more capabilities than what traditional SCA things actually do. So I don't necessarily see these two projects as you know, competitors. They're different ways of looking at the same problem, and depending on your use case, you might opt to use one tool or the other.
Okay, so then there is a question regarding user management and how user management applies to the specific project. So can you tell us a little bit about how is it possible to, for example, say you have multiple departments, they have their individual applications, for example. How far can you go with OWASP DependencyTrack to make sure that, for example, like there are like a super admin that sees everything, but the departments only see what is in their application and things like that?
Yeah, that's some things that the DependencyTrack project is actually in the process of implementing. So right now, there is not a concept, and there will not be a concept of a super admin that sees all. Everything is based on specific permissions, and if you have those permissions, you will be able to do certain things. One thing that's currently missing, which is currently in the process and will be available in the next release of DependencyTrack, is support for access control list for projects, right? So this is the idea of maybe I have, a dozen projects that belong to one BU and another dozen projects and they belong to another business unit. So being able to separate that out. But again, just because you're an administrator doesn't mean you actually have access to this stuff. So again, permission model, but that ACL support is actually coming in the next release of DependencyTrack. I think it's been the most. I think it's the most widely requested feature just for that purpose.
Okay, no, great. Also, for the whole thing, will there or is there already a possibility to bind it to an existing Active Directory so that you don't have to like recreate all your users and groups and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. The documentation has examples on how to integrate with Active Directory, Open LDAP, Novell eDirectory, if you want to go that far back. So there's examples on how to integrate with all these directory services. It's fairly simple, actually. So it's fairly elementary to set up. It also supports OIDC, so that makes it even easier because there are no users really in DependencyTrack at all. So that's actually that's the easy button, the OIDC. Once you actually set it up, it's much easier.
Okay,
and
cool.
There's actually an open ticket for SAML support. So if anybody is still using SAML and wants to contribute to that, we would love to support it because there are still a lot of organizations that still use SAML today.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Is there overall a proper plugin or extension interface that make it easy to extend it, or can you tell us a little bit more about like the architecture it's on a like high level of DependencyTrack?
Yeah, so DependencyTrack is broken out into two different components right now. We've got the front end component, which is it's a Vue.js application. It's compiled, and distributed as a thing in and of itself. It's distributed as a Docker container. The front end is, and then we've got the back end, which is currently it's the API server, and right now it is a monolith, but it's structured in a way where everything is asynchronous and event driven. So it really uses all available cores. So the more memory, the more CPUs you can throw at it, the happier DependencyTrack will actually be, especially when you have lots and lots of projects. I've seen organizations with thousands of projects in their portfolio and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of components. So the more resources you can allocate to that, the better. However, because everything is event driven, there are plans on breaking this thing out into further, more discrete components. Now, I'm not going to go the microservice route. Microservices are not the right architecture for DependencyTrack, but I think more service domains, I think, as a concept, works much better for DependencyTrack just because a lot of these things are so interrelated. If we actually went the microservice route, there would just be an enormous amount of complexity. Which would be, it's just not sustainable for an open source project like this. And it also would just would greatly increase the amount of maintenance and operational overhead. But there are plans to separate out some of the various forms of analysis so that you'll have an engine that is responsible solely for vulnerability analysis. You'll have another engine that's solely supported for, maybe outdated component analysis. Another engine that only does like policy violations, for example. And another engine, and this is the big one actually, is metrics. All those time series metrics, that actually takes a lot of resources to do. So being able to scale that one service up, horizontally would be a big win for performance. So because although it's a monolith, everything currently is event driven. It's fairly easy to decouple these things into domain-specific services. And I can envision a future release where the API server doesn't really do anything other than serves APIs. And then we'll probably have like maybe 4 or 5 different types of services to support the entire application.
Okay, cool. So what else do we have? Yeah, that's an interesting one. Regarding, of course, as you mentioned, that there are organizations already having like 1,000+ projects in there, having, of course, then therefore a lot of components to manage. And I guess in especially those kinds of organization, you have like a rather big security team looking at the information in DependencyTrack and wondering, okay, where should we actually do something? Because they will never get to a point where, oh, we do not have any kind of vulnerabilities in in any application. Is there a way in DependencyTrack on like having the big picture and seeing, okay, for example, depending on the severity of vulnerabilities and how often they appear in like critical applications, to like narrow down on where to prioritize the resources to actually solve problems?
That's a great question. I've seen a number of organizations actually integrate DependencyTrack with general purpose BI tools. I've seen, Domo, for example, and Tableau being used to answer these types of questions. So I think there's enough data in DependencyTrack for you to be able to create your own types of reports. But DependencyTrack itself, outside of the dashboards and whatnot that it gives you, doesn't actually give you any reporting capabilities. And one of the reasons why is that every organization wants different kind of reports. And creating a reporting engine is a project in and of itself. So we really encourage the use of other reporting engines when possible. There's a lot of open source ones available. And there's one from the Apache project that's fantastic, actually, that I use. But there's a bunch of other commercial ones as well. So there's enough information in DependencyTrack for you to integrate with these general purpose BI tools.
Okay, so you would say that like in general, it's good to have the information there, but as soon as you do any kind of like real analysis on the data or business decisions, then there might be a better way on besides of using the UI you have on DependencyTrack.
Yeah, and there's actually DependencyTrack itself has an API first design, so technically, there's actually more capabilities in the API that are not exposed in the UI. So there's actually more things you can do natively with the API than you can do just in the user interface. So you can use the API natively and integrate that with BI tools would definitely be the way to go. I've seen it used with things like threat fix. Kenna Securities is a good one that I've seen a lot of organizations adopt. I personally use it with Domo. It works really good for that use case. But there's all kinds of other things that you can integrate with, and using some other APIs that may not necessarily be available in the UI to actually slice and dice the data that you how you want to see it. Okay.
Yeah, what else do we have? So this is a rather simple one. I think that's a yes or no one. You showed in your demo that you can basically suppress specific information. On what level can that be done? Can this also, instead of only a single vulnerability, can this also be done like for a whole library? So for example, saying I don't care really on Bootstrap, and then you can basically just suppress all the like warnings or whatever from Bootstrap?
That is not currently supported. Pull requests are highly encouraged.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. I think you already mentioned it, but I'm still going to ask it. So for especially like legacy code, like even if you have like binary libraries, things like that, is it still possible to create an SBOM? So here, the question is specifically for CycloneDX. Is it possible to use it for creating SBOMs for things like that? So for example, ActiveX component, things like that, or any DLLs?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of providers already, commercial providers, SCA providers that do binary analysis that can output CycloneDX today, and there's several more kind of lined up that's going to be able to produce these in the future. So yeah, binary SCA is a very valuable thing, especially if you're if this is not something that you've actually produced yourself, or maybe you no longer have this build pipeline around. This is a very valid use case. So things like Sonatype Nexus IQ already do binary analysis. So you could, do something like that. There's other SCA vendors also that are in the process. There's mobile vendors that are doing the same. And they're actually tying in the services as well, which is really interesting. So yeah, binary SCA is definitely a use case. And then once you actually get those CycloneDX SBOMs from that binary SCA product, you can then import those into DependencyTrack.
Okay, cool. Yeah, then we're going to the last few ones, I guess. I hope you still have time for a few.
Sure.
So perfect. So yeah, if companies after the great presentation now think, well, DependencyTrack, great, we want to start it in our company, we want to start using it. So what would you recommend on how to get started without getting completely overwhelmed with all the information and all the integration work you would have to do to like bring it to the whole organization at once?
Yeah, I would start with one or two projects, maybe that represent the types of languages or ecosystems that your organization supports, and start producing the software bill of materials now, right? As organizations, we're going to have more and more requirements to produce SBOMs, regardless of whether or not you adopt DependencyTrack or not. That's kind of irrelevant. Start producing those software bill of materials. That's your first step. Fortunately, CycloneDX makes it very, very easy to do so. Visit the CycloneDX Tools Center. It has a lot of different, if you want to target like NPM or Maven or Gradle or CocoaPods, whatever kind of ecosystem that you want to support, choose one that's representative of your organization, and just figure out the integration just on that. Once you actually have that software bill of material produced, see if then make sure it's accurate. Is my inventory actually accurate, and am I using any modified components or not? And if you are, you can actually CycloneDX by design has a very, very simplistic model, right? By design, its main focus was on automation. Right. So if there's something that you need to additionally do to that bill of material that you just created, you can actually very easily do that and augment and enhance that SBOM throughout your build pipeline. And the resulting SBOM, just make sure it's accurate and representative of reality. And once you actually have that, then you can start thinking of, oh, how will I integrate this with X tool, whether it's DependencyTrack, some other open source project, or maybe a commercial tool, right? But you're producing an SBOM is really your first step. Now, I will say that, again, CycloneDX is really focused on automation. And one of the things that most organizations do is they integrate it with their build pipeline, or with their build system, right? Their package manager, whatever. So we've got Maven plugins, Gradle plugins, CocoaPods, Ruby, Rust. There's all kinds of language support that we have, and that's what most organizations do. And if you've got 1,000 builds in your environment, that could seem like quite a substantial task, right? The other option for this, however, is instead of integrating with the build itself, you can integrate with the software factory, right? So maybe you're using GitHub Actions, for example, to build all your software. Well, guess what? CycloneDX has, I don't know, 5 or 6 different GitHub Actions that you can use, and you don't necessarily have to touch all of these thousands of builds in your environment. So start off with one project, and then think about how you're going to scale this thing out to produce SBOMs at scale across your organization. That would be my advice.
Okay, and what would you say is the current, let's say, level or the current health of package management system in helping you doing that? So I mean that there are definitely, I guess, some package managers that make it way easier to actually build a proper SBOM than others. Where would you say what is the current level there?
Yeah, it depends on the ecosystem, obviously. Package managers are not perfect. Some package managers are better than others. But it's going to get you most of the way there, right? It's not going to be 100% reality. So if you do need to make a couple changes here and there, it's okay. And CycloneDX, again, has a very prescriptive, very simple object model that really lends itself toward high degrees of automation. So if you do need to correct something in your build pipeline, it's very elementary for you to do so. But package managers are going to get you 90% there, roughly.
Okay. And then one last question, and then I think we can leave you go. So do you have any kind of, let's call it, the references for more or less enterprises or even really larger enterprises that already use DependencyTrack and had good experience with it?
I know a lot of organizations that use them. I'm not going to name drop, but I will say everything from financial services, so figure banks, the credit card companies themselves. I know a lot of security organizations are using them. Security vendors that you probably have in your own environment are using them. Large defense contractors, governments are using this. Cloud providers. I've seen global manufacturers like OEMs that build things for other companies. I've seen automotive organizations using this. Consumer electronics companies, right? So, I mean, the spectrum of the type of organization is really across the board. There's tens of thousands of orgs producing and consuming and analyzing these SBOMs with DependencyTrack today. So chances are highly likely that there's an organization in your same vertical that is already doing this and has been doing this for a few years now. So it's supported in a lot of places.
Okay.
Maybe adding here an additional question. Where would you put people to ask their questions? Where is the correct place to go?
Ah, yes, that's a great question. So the DependencyTrack project has a fairly active Slack channel on the OWASP Slack workspace. So OWASP has its own Slack workspace with tens of thousands of members already in that workspace. And DependencyTrack has a dedicated channel, PROJ-DependencyTrack, I think, is the name of the channel. And fairly active, great community of folks that are always willing to help out with any kind of questions or whatnot. Regarding CycloneDX, so CycloneDX actually has its own Slack workspace independent of OWASP. So it's CycloneDX is now an OWASP project, but it's almost its own little mini foundation, right? It has its own governance, it has its own standardization process. It operates independently as a meritocracy, and it has its own Slack workspace. So it's if you go to, in both cases actually, if you go to dependencytrack.org/Slack/invite, you'll not only get the invite, but you'll go directly to the DependencyTrack channel. Or if you go to CycloneDX.org/Slack/invite, you'll get the invite for CycloneDX and go directly to the general channel. But for CycloneDX, there's, I think, a dozen or more different channels. We actually have individual channels for every single one of the implementations. So if you actually have questions on, I don't know, the Maven implementation or the .NET implementation or CocoaPods or whatever, there's dedicated channels set up for each one of the implementations to help adapters out.
Perfect. Thank you. I think, Patty, are you still here? Would you do the closing for us?
I'm still here, yeah, but go on if you like. Or if not, then yeah, then let me close down things. And thank you again, Steve, for being with us. We tremendously enjoyed your presentation here. We're very happy you could make it directly before your holiday even. And we wish you a very nice evening and happy holiday. And everybody else who has joined, thanks for joining. We're happy we're here, and we'll make sure that you'll have soon the opportunity to join us again in the next OWASP Switzerland talk around September. So hope to see you all there and enjoy the evening.
Thanks, everyone.